This Safe Secret Series episode is dedicated to any Dearborn girl who has struggled with sexual abuse or domestic violence. We love you. This is your host, Rima Ahmad Fadlallah, proud daughter of Dearborn and professional love letter, and today we are joined by Sara Raad, poet, domestic violence survivor, and advocate. How are you, Sara?
Good, how are you?
Good. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you.
You have something in front of you, and we are going to have you read it to our listeners today.
Yes. These are missing pages, are titled The Great Shame. Growing up, I was taught we can't play with boys or talk to them or anything of the sorts. The only boys you can talk to are your teachers and family. As a teenager, I had a crush like anyone else, and we ended up dating. It actually was for almost 2 years. It was the first time I have experienced sexual harassment and sexual abuse from someone close to me. I was trapped in that relationship till I had the courage to change my number and delete all social media so he couldn't contact me. My family, when they found out, cared more about what people were going to think. They were worried about if I'll ever get married instead of getting me actual help. It led to depression and a couple of suicide attempts. We need to stop this. We're human beings. Our first thought shouldn't be, what is the neighbor going to think? It should be, how can I help my child? We can't keep doing this to our kids, putting others' views and opinions above our own mental health. And if you're ever going through anything, please get help.
What are your reactions to that?
It's kind of like what I was talking to you about before we started about reputation and helping one another. And to be honest, it's sad that we have to experience these things as women in our community. But at the same time, it's a good thing that we have people like her speaking up.
Right.
And that's really important. I went through something similar, a lot actually. I can resonate with this a lot. This is kind of how my abusive relationship started at first. It was, me falling in love with a guy that I went to school with and my parents finding out. And instead of, being supportive and hearing me out, I even asked them, if he could meet them, try to do it the right way. Instead, they said, no, our reputation. And as their daughter, I had to kind of, respect that. But at the same time, I was following my heart. And it's hard to not listen to your heart sometimes when that's the only thing you feel at the moment in your body. And through all that, the more my family kept pushing me away from him, the more I wanted him.
Mm-hmm.
And so...
How old were you, if you don't mind me asking?
I was actually 14 when this happened, so it was like the end of 8th grade.
Okay.
So I stayed with him for a total of 10 years, on and off, hiding it from my family, hiding it from our neighbors, my aunts, the community, because it was frowned upon to date. We weren't allowed to date. We weren't allowed to really talk to guys. I never really had guy friends, so me being with him was a big deal.
Yeah.
So, like I said, the more they told me no, the more it got me closer to him. And so now that I look back on it, I believe that my love for him was formed on being rebellious in a sense and proving to my family and my friends that no, I can be with him and he is a great person. But little did I know that I was trying to put makeup basically on a scab.
Mm-hmm.
So it was hard because as I was convincing them to accept him, which eventually they did, I was slowly realizing that this guy wasn't the same guy that I first met. Slowly his real layer started to peel, and I was starting to make excuses for him for his actions. So at that time, he knew that I loved him. He knew that I would do anything for him, and he used that to control me, manipulate me, anything you can think of, emotionally wise. So by the time he started abusing me, I was already hooked. So when
How old were you at this point?
I was about 21 years old.
When was it that your parents were accepting of the relationship?
At that time, 21 years old. Yeah. So as soon as my parents accepted it, we got married. We had a traditional Arabic wedding. We moved in with each other, and it just got worse from there.
This is something you and I talked about, abuse is a big word,
Yeah.
and it's not a word Dearborn likes to use.
Right.
And it's a word that we might use to talk about other people and their situation. A lot of us don't want to talk about ways that we've been abused.
Right.
And we might not even realize it.
Yeah.
What is abuse?
Abuse is controlling another person, manipulating them, physically hitting them, emotionally manipulating them to basically control them in a sense. Like they want to control you. Like, here's one thing one saying I like to stick by: they don't love you, they love the idea of controlling you. And by the time you realize you're being abused, and it can be financially, sexually, mentally, emotionally, and physically, you're hooked. Like they manipulate you to the point where you feel like you don't deserve anybody. There's no way out. You may have some strings attached to them. It could be kids, it could be financial situations, it could be assets, it could be anything. You make up any excuse in your head not to leave because you are at the point when you figure out you're being abused, you're in denial. You're like, no. This can't be happening to me. I'm this person. I'm this person's daughter. I work here. How can that be me? I'm educated. But I think that's one of the problems, is that a lot of young women are not educated to know what exactly abuse is, and I think there needs to be more education about that in our community.
So for the women who are educated on what abuse is, what do you think makes them deny their situation?
I would say, I guess, admitting that they are being abused. It's hard to really admit and say, like, hey, I'm being abused.
Right.
Also, them thinking that there isn't any resources out there. There isn't any help out there. There isn't anybody who's been through similar situations as them. They're afraid that they might be judged by their friends, their family, their extended family. It can be so many different factors. Everybody has like such unique, such different lives. It can be anything in that boat.
Yeah.
So
you were 21, and that's when you realized that you were being abused.
Yes.
Were you able to vocalize it that way?
No.
Okay. So walk me through that. Like, who were you at that point? What was happening in your head? Who were you talking to about it? Were you having conversations with him about it? What was your life like at that point?
It was dark, very dark. At that time, actually, my family did accept him, but at the same time, they were no longer in my life. So I was facing this alone. I did have his family, but it's kind of hard to get help from the person's family, who's abusing you. So, so I was alone throughout the whole relationship, during that time. I had myself, and to be honest with you, I would sit down and talk to myself when I was alone. I would have conversations in the mirror.
Wow.
I would
love
cry.
that.
Yeah, and that's when I started to form a bond with myself. Is because nobody, as much as I wanted to speak my mind and to scream and to cry, I felt that nobody could understand me. And I felt like as though my conversations with myself in the mirror or alone at night or crying with my pillow allowed me to basically realize what was going on even more. And I kept reading articles like on the internet. I'm like, what is abuse? What does it mean when he calls me names? Is he just frustrated? Or he said I'm getting fat. He said he can find somebody better. I started Googling all these things, and they all link to these two words, actually, domestic violence. And I'm like, no. No, that's not me. So I would close my internet browser. Again, it would happen, and same two words popped up. And that's how I basically educated myself. I'm like, I'm in a domestic violence situation, and I clicked on, a random website, and the first thing I noticed on the website was a big red button that said escape. And I pressed it, and it exited out of the page automatically and deleted it from my history. It's to that extent. Domestic violence has, it's serious. And it's happening to people it's happening to somebody you saw on the street, it's happening to the person who's smiling all day. It's happening a lot, and it shouldn't be like that, but it's serious. And when they have websites for domestic violence that have escape buttons on the right hand side of the screen, or they have escape plans for women, or they have shelters, or they have little little cards to keep in your wallet, it's serious. If it wasn't a big deal and if it wasn't serious, then why would they have all those things? Why would depression be a big link to domestic violence, anxiety, PTSD, all those things?
Right.
And I think that's something that needs to be brought forth to our community, because we need to realize that our mental health is important. Nobody deserves to be abused. And it's okay to speak up, because you have other women in your community who are willing to help.
Something that I think about a lot is the way sex education happens or doesn't happen in Dearborn, and how that affects us. And, I mean, we know how it goes.
Yeah.
Sex is not something we ever talk about until we're married.
Yeah.
And then it's just suddenly overnight permissible and expected.
Yeah.
And so that dynamic, going from being ashamed of this thing, having it be so taboo, to it being something that is almost, I don't want to say obligatory, but kind of, how does that dynamic play out in relationships where women are being sexually harassed by their husbands?
It's just the fact that, to me, I think it's the fact that they think that just because they're married or they're in a relationship with somebody, they feel obligated to say yes. Like, they're not allowed to say no. But the thing is, no means no. I don't care if you're married. I don't care if you're in a serious relationship. Somebody who truly loves you will not force you to do something you don't want to do. And it happens a lot. It really does.
Do you think that part of, you were saying earlier, the shame around admitting it. Do you think any of that shame could be linked to, specifically with women who are married, them feeling like, how there's this whole, you're damaged goods after you've had sex, even if you divorce the person, even if you go through it, not that I have to explain all of this, but I think a lot of women who deal with divorce or the fear of divorce are thinking about the fact that they've had sex and being afraid to admit that, just being afraid to have that conversation around the health or lack of health in the relationship and what implications that has on their reputation or their future relationships. Is that something that you think informs their fear and shame to talk about it.
Absolutely. I that was something I dealt with when I got divorced. The first thing I told my parents was, so now I'm your daughter and I'm divorced and I'm moving back into your house. What family is going to look at me now after, number one, I've been abused, and number two, I'm basically damaged goods and I have baggage. And
did you feel that way about yourself? Was it you reconciling the perspective other people would have of you, or was that how you felt about yourself too?
At one point I did, because by the time I had left my abuser, I was numb, and I was just running off anxiety. So when all that wore off, I was just kind of like, then my thoughts came to me, and I'm just like, now what? You know, what do I do now? Like, I'm basically damaged goods. Like, who's gonna want a girl who's divorced? You know, what family's gonna look at me the way they look at a girl who hasn't been married? But why should I be punished for that? Because I technically did things the right way, you know? So there was, I would say that didn't cause me to stay with him longer, because at the point where I left him, I wanted to just be alive. That was the first thing in my head. So, yeah, definitely being divorced, living in Dearborn, even finding a sheikh to divorce me was a mission itself, especially for that reason. It was quite a roller coaster, but my advice would be to not give up, just to keep on going, and you deserve respect and love.
So you were around 21, and I keep bringing us back.
Yeah.
No, I
it's
mean,
fine.
this is me. There's so many questions, and I'm sure a lot of people are thinking as well. So 21, I'm imagining you know, like you said, it's a dark time. You're looking in your mirror, you're pep talking yourself, you're trying to bring yourself back to life. You realize that it's domestic abuse, and then what?
And then I actually started to look at ways on how to change myself so that way he wouldn't abuse me, because I thought it was me. You're that manipulated. And I started to change the way I carried myself, basically. I was acting like somebody who was not me. And eventually, like, when he would leave the house, like, I just got exhausted. Like, I was exhausted of being that person I wasn't, and that person was walking on eggshells. And I had to watch what I said, what I did, what I wore, how I stood next to him, how I sat next to him. Any movement I made, anything, I had to just think, like, is he gonna get mad about this? Is this gonna make him angry? I found myself living for him. And I'm a pretty strong person, but when it's your life, that's basically on the line. You'd be surprised at what you would do to stay alive. And you know, I've gotten that question, why'd you stay? And I don't get mad at that question anymore, because I use that opportunity as a teaching opportunity, because they're curious. Why did I stay? But why did he hit? You know, I like to ask back. So why did I stay? I stayed because I had gone back to him several times. Like, I would leave him, I'd come back, leave him, come back, leave him, come back.
What was that process like? Tell me about one of the situations where you would leave. What was happening in your head? Did you think it was over, you know, and why would you come back?
So the first time I left him, I actually found out I was pregnant. It turned out to be, we went to our first ultrasound, and it turned out to be a molar pregnancy, which is basically, instead of a baby forming, it was a tumor. So I was confused. I was like, okay, this is our first kid, what's going on? And the first person I looked at in that room was him. And I can just see, like, disappointment all over his face, as if it was, like, something I did wrong, you know? And when the doctor took us back into the room and told us, basically, it's nothing we could have both done to prevent it. It was just science, that's what he said. We were just kind of like, okay, and I started crying, and he just kind of had this, like, blank look on his face. And I told myself in my head, I'm like, okay, Sarah, you got to stop crying, because you got to put on your tough face now, because you have to make sure he doesn't do anything to you, because I was convinced that he thought it was my fault. So I had to get a DNC. I had to get surgery to remove the molar pregnancy. So the day of the surgery, leading up to the day of the surgery, the way I handled my depression when it came to that was staying home, crying, being by myself. He would go out, stay out all night till 4 a.m, and he'd come back the next day and basically get mad at me for being all sad and crying. So when it came time to the morning of the surgery, he picked a fight with me. I don't even know, I can't even remember why. It was something so small, something that was not even related to what was happening that day. And he had hit me twice on my head. And my sister was outside. She came to pick me up. And she saw me coming outside crying. And she asked me what was wrong. And I just looked at her, and something inside me told me, don't tell her yet. Just don't tell her. And I just looked at her, and I'm like, I'm upset because I'm about to get surgery.
Were you wanting to protect his image at that point?
Yeah.
Okay.
And at the time, like, I was also hormonal too. And it was pretty hard to kind of, like, I guess, switch that role of me feeling sad to lying to my sister.
Yeah.
So after I had gotten this, before I got the surgery, as they were prepping me, they asked me if I had recently bumped my head or anything like that, because they were going to put me under. And I lied to them. I said no, because I knew that action would have been taken right then and there, and I just didn't want to deal with the aftermath of him getting upset with me for doing that. So I ended up waking up 4 hours after the time I was supposed to wake up. They were going to keep me overnight because he had hit my head so hard. And I woke up, and that's when I told my sister what happened, and I chose to leave him that day. Stayed with her for a week, was crying all week, and at that point I couldn't even mourn the loss of what was going to be a baby for me. I was mourning the loss of him, because I was so manipulated by him that I just felt like I couldn't be with anybody else but him. So I ended up going back to him, and it was just an excuse after an excuse that I made about him, and I was trying to actually convince myself that he was a good guy. He was the guy that I first fell in love with when I was at the end of 8th grade, and I was convinced that guy was still in him, and I think that's why I held on.
When you were experiencing these kinds of moments where you were coming back, were there moments that you would consider highs, where things would seem for a second like they were the same as you guys were back in 8th grade? In between him being abusive and in between him being, were there those moments that kind of tricked you and pulled on your heart, where you wanted to see him? They kind of helped you see him that way.
Yeah, absolutely. There were a lot of times like that. We had the best times. There were times where we would go out to eat and he'd be the most amazing guy, hold the door open for me, for other women, men, families, say hi to old senior citizens, all that stuff. We'd go on vacations. Everything was normal. But I remember him telling me one day that he told me, he said, I know you like the back of my hand. I know what makes you happy, I know what makes you sad, and I know what gets you. Just remember that. And those words stuck with me. So I don't know if he was playing the part, but if he was doing a great job at it, because I was so manipulated to the point where I felt his moods with him, basically. So whenever he was happy, I was like, okay, Sarah, time to be happy. When he was sad, it's like, uh-oh, Sarah, what'd you do wrong? Or if he was mad, Sarah, what'd you do wrong? So there were great moments, absolutely.
I say that not to romanticize the situation.
Yeah.
I say that because I think I've heard situations where, 10 times, there might be 10 horrible situations, but because of what you've just said, people's fear of leaving, it just takes that one, glimmer of hope.
Yeah.
Like, he can change. Or, so like what myths are there around this space of this question that people love to ask of why did you stay? What other myths are there that exist?
There's a lot of myths. One myth is, that he's having a stressful day. Just because he's having a stressful day does not give him an excuse to abuse you in any kind of way. If he drinks or smokes or is under the influence, that's no reason why he should be abusing you. Also, if he grew up around it, he didn't grow up around it, so I can only speak on that part. But that's a myth as well. And I just there's a lot of myths that go along with it, but I would say don't hold on to the person because of how many years you've been with that person. Don't think that they love you. They may love the idea of you, or the idea of controlling you because they know you so well. And it's something that's it's really deep to be in, and it's really hard to get out, but it's doable because there are resources out there for women and men and children. I actually brought this card with me. I went through First Step, and they helped me with many of their services they have on this card. But this card, actually, there's more meaning behind it than just a foldable card. The way you're supposed to give this to somebody is very discreet. So if I sense that you were in an abusive relationship and I was at the grocery store or something, I would have this card in my purse, as I do. And if I saw you with your abuser or who I thought was your abuser, and I know based on my experience that you may need some resources or some help, I can come up to you and compliment you and introduce myself and say, hey, how are you? I like your jacket.
Wow.
So that it's
Wow.
that it's small enough to fit into the palm of your hands. It has resources on there. It has many different things. It has their website, the helpline.
How did you? So tell us. So you used this when you left him completely.
Yes,
Walk us through like the months before that, this moment, months after that. Tell us that story.
So before I left him.
Mm-hmm. Like what was it getting to with that? Because I know you gave us an example of that situation. when you saw your sister and you had to explain it, you ended up
Yeah.
explaining it, and you said that there had been a couple more times where you wanted to leave.
Yeah.
Right? And so what led up to this last straw?
The last straw, my mother passed away when I was, thank you, when I was just 21 days old, so I never really met my mother. But I can't begin to describe to you the bond that I have with her. And I carry her picture with me everywhere. So when I find myself confused on a situation, I tend to sit alone and talk to her. And I did that with school. I actually had a dream about her, and I don't really dream about her often. I dreamt that, she ran into a coffee shop that I was at with school books. And I said, "Mom, what are you doing here?" And she said, "Sarah, I gotta go, but I need to tell you something." I'm like, "Yeah, sure, what's up?" And she said, "I love you, and make sure you go to school." And at the time, I wasn't going to school.
Wow.
And I'm like, "Okay, but what are you doing here?" I was still like, what are you doing in, like, this coffee shop? And so she ran out with the books, and I ran after her, and I opened up the door. Everything was all white. And I woke up the next morning, and when I dream about my mom, it really takes a toll on me because I don't do it often. So I enrolled in college the next day.
Wow.
So she helped me with that. So at this point, when it came to this particular situation, he came home one night, and I already knew that he was going to start something with me. So
How did you know that? Just the energy?
The energy. Right when he walked in, he was just kind of like, "Oh, what are you doing?" Just stuff like that. And being abused, you kind of know the routine. As weird as that sounds, you know your routine. And he was in the shower, and he left the door open, and he was basically yelling at me from the shower as he was taking a shower. And I just kind of had that moment, and I sat at the edge of the bed, and I looked up at the ceiling, and I said, "Mom, I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to help me leave." And when I said that, my heart, it physically, I felt like as if my heart, shed a tear. I'm not trying to be,
No,
literally, it was like a call out for help. And even though she wasn't physically there, I felt that she was so close to me at that very moment that I knew that her being my mother, she would do anything in, her power to help me. So I asked her to help me, and, my eyes started getting watery, and he came out of the shower, and he saw my tears, and that just opened up a whole new book, a whole new problem. He was asking me why I was crying, and basically making me feel like I shouldn't cry about anything. I have nothing to cry about. So that night, he abused me from midnight till 4 a.m. I couldn't sleep. He wouldn't let me sleep. It was to the point where I was held at gunpoint and had a knife to my neck. And all I can think in that moment was, "Sarah, you can do this. Just listen to him. Do anything you can, just listen to him." And the first thing he did was he took my keys and my phone, and he put them somewhere. He forced me to take off my clothes and grabbed 2 water bottles from the fridge, poured them all over me, and just pushed me outside and locked the door. And it was January. It was freezing outside, and I told myself, okay, I can run away now, but I have no clothes on. I have nowhere to go. Literally, I was naked in January outside with water on me. So I'm like, no, just, I gotta get some clothes on. So he opened up the door, and that's when he grabbed me by my hair and strangled me to the point where it was just all black. And finally, when he was done, he started crying. And he told me, "Do you see what you do to me? Do you see what you made me do to you?" And I had set my alarm on my phone for the next day, previously that day. And I was sleeping on my bed, like, literally, like, just very, like, stiff. And I heard my alarm from, I guess he put my phone on top of the fridge. So I woke up, and he said, "Where do you think you're going?" And I said, "I'm going to work." And he said, "Looking like that?" And I said, "What do you mean?" And then I went inside the bathroom, and he had, busted my lip. There was scratches all over my neck, bruises, pop veins in my eye. And I just found a turtleneck, and I put it on, and I lied to him. And I told him, "I can't miss work or else I'll be fired. I'm still on probation." So at that point, I told myself, like, okay, this is it, you gotta go. So I wanted to play it out as smooth as I could. I didn't tell him I was leaving. I asked him if he wanted anything from Tim Hortons, as I usually would. Kept it cool. Although there was fire inside me, he said yeah. And I went to Tim Hortons, got him his drink, and I came back. I gave him his drink, and I gave him a kiss, knowing it was going to be my last kiss to him. And I turned around, and he said, "Hey, Sarah." And I said yes, and he said, "I want to have a good day." And I just looked at him, and I'm like, "Yeah, I do too." And so I left everything behind. My clothes, everything. Everything. I walked out with the clothes on my back that day, my phone, and my laptop, and my math book at the time. And I just got into my car, and I called my mom, and I told her, I was like, "I'm sorry, but I need your help. I need you." And I pulled into work, and she came and picked me up, and that's when I filed a police report, blocked his number right away, and basically just went home and just sat with my family for a second, and we kind of all, we were trying to all absorb the fact, what was happening. And my dad, I didn't even want to look at my dad, because, nobody wants to see their daughter like that. And I just, for some reason, that time just felt so different to me. I was just so numb. I've never felt that numbness before. I've never had that strength before, but you know what? Enough was enough. 6 years of dealing with the abuse was enough, and I just remember wanting to live. I felt that I had a purpose. I felt that he's not going to determine when my life was over. I am. Wow. And that was the day I finally stood my ground, and I never looked back. Until this day, I have never, I never said a word to him, and he has tried, after I pressed charges. I pressed charges, I went through with court, everything. It was the hardest experience of my life, dealing with court and domestic violence and all that, but, and the stalking afterwards and all that stuff.
Were you scared?
I wasn't, because I don't know how this is going to sound, but if he was going to do something to me, it if he was planning on doing something to me, he would be, excuse my French, but stupid enough to think that, number one, he can get away with it, or number two, like, the protection that I have on me now, like, it's not even just my family, it's, like, God and, you know, my mom, everything. You just have, like, you just feel powerful after leaving a situation like that, you know? And
what kind of, for people who are considering leaving, so people who have identified they're in an abusive relationship, who are trying to do what you did, how can we, I guess, what advice can you give them? I don't even know how to think of this question because I've never been through this, but I guess what I'm trying to ask is, for people who are so intimidated by this process, scared of what's going to happen next, what are people going to say? Is he going to stalk me? Is he going to, like, I think I can imagine from hearing the story, at that time you feel, like you said, so manipulated, so victimized, that the idea of you just feel like this person has so much power over you, even if you were able to escape. How do you talk to somebody who feels that way?
I would tell them that they are worthy and deserving of love and respect. Everybody is. And I wouldn't pressure them, in a sense. I wouldn't tell them what you're doing is wrong. If anything, I would offer them resources that are out there that they probably don't know that they have. Or I would connect them with somebody who's gone through the similar experience. It could be someone the same age as them, somebody older than them. And domestic violence does not discriminate. It can happen to somebody who's a doctor, who's a lawyer, who's even a police officer, or who's, you know, your neighbor down the street. You know, just let that person know that they are not alone, and offer your guidance. Don't pressure them to leave, but make sure you stay and support them.
Yeah.
That's very important.
So before we get into resources, because I do want you to talk about resources that you've been able to use, if you're willing to volunteer yourself as a resource, I also want to have you give that information. But one last question before that, to people who, and I'm one of them, not in this particular situation, but I'm one of the people who has been a judgmental friend in situations like this that I don't understand. You know, you're growing up, you hear what your parents say, you hear about, like, oh, you have a friend who's in a relationship where the guy might not be abusing her, but isn't treating her the way that you want him to treat her. And you think you're doing the right thing as a friend by saying, like, leave, what are you doing? Stop being stupid. You're smarter than this. Like, all of these things that we think are empowering. Like, what do we say to the best friend who is trying to support her friend but is really probably judging her or not really helping the situation?
I would offer her your support. Let her know that you're here, but also let her know that it makes you sad to see her like this. And you can give her an example. You can say, it hurt me the other day seeing you upset because you and so argued this way. I feel that you deserve to be happy. You know, just kind of like rewording the situation, because a lot of people who are in that type of relationship, they kind of get defensive right away.
Yeah.
So to kind of like, you can say things but just kind of like reword it in a sense, and you know your friend more than anybody. So you know how to talk to your friend, and just think about it. They may not be ready to leave, but them hearing,
it plants a seed.
Yes, them hearing you, offering your support, and being a friend to them and not judging them, can actually make them realize faster that they're, you know, or sooner, that they are in a toxic relationship.
So it seems like what you're saying is that friends or loved ones who notice someone might be in an abusive relationship should continue to remind them of what they're worth and what they deserve.
Yes, and, you know, don't get too involved to the point where, you know, their abuser kind of sees you getting involved. If anything, you can help your friend make an escape plan. You can think of a code word. Like for my friends that I use, if they're, let's just say, out on a date with a guy, for example, we use the code pineapple if it's going wrong, or ice cream if it's good. So it's just like little things like that won't put them in harm.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's just kind of like you're protecting them in a sense, and just know that when they finally come out to you and they tell you a little bit of what's going on in their relationship, if it may be abusive, just know that it's like the tip of like a very big iceberg.
Wow.
Let's just say. So it takes a lot for them to finally come out and say that, hey, this is happening to me. So kind of take it in and just be careful with how you respond, because it was probably not easy for them to do so.
So, what led to your poetry? I read your poetry. I love your poetry, and a lot of it, I write poetry too, so I can see that it's coming from growth, pain, growing pains, all of the above, and I can imagine from a lot of the things that you've learned through what you've shared today. Is that true? Is that...
Yeah. So after I left my abuser, I was dealing with anxiety and depression, and I was just so frustrated one day that I just thought to write down how I was feeling, and it just came out poetic. And I just kind of glanced at my paper. I'm like, oh wow, this is different. So I showed it to my mom, I showed it to my brother, I showed it to my sister and everybody else that was around me at the time, and they said, wow, it's really nice, it's a poem. And I'm like, yeah, but it's how I feel. And that's kind of like when I like discovered that, because I used to write, when I was like in 6th grade, but then I stopped because you can only write so much when you're in 6th grade.
Yeah.
But that just kind of like led me to kind of open up more. I was going to therapy twice a week, and I was working out every day, eating healthy, just trying to do better for myself. But for some reason, I kept my feelings closed in because I was just so used to that, being in a abusive relationship in the past, because you're not allowed to feel. Technically, you're not allowed to show emotions, or else you'll get punished for it. So I was basically like used to just keeping everything in. So slowly my thoughts just came out, and when they did, like one time I was driving and I was like, oh my god, I need to write this down. So then it started getting more and more and more, and I now like voice to text my poems while I'm driving, because as soon as it hits me, like you have to write it right then and there. Like,
and it comes from something else. Like it's like,
yeah.
Like
I don't know, it's like something that just like takes over you, I know. So that is what led my my poetry page to happen. And I found that I connected with a lot of young women in general and in our community, because a lot of my poems are like what you said, about abuse, domestic violence, emotions, growing pains, and all that. So I found that it connected more with people that way, instead of coming up to somebody and saying like, oh, are you in an abusive relationship? Wow. So people would read my poems and be like, oh my god, this poem, this poem reminds me a lot about my relationship, and I've been in a relationship and that's how they start talking to me. They start opening up to me, and they start telling me about their relationship and how long they've been with the person, and they ask me, is that considered abusive? Is it not? Is it okay to feel this way? I've been depressed, etc. And these are all things that I struggled with, and I still struggle with to this day. Depression and anxiety and PTSD, and I'm very open to talk to them regarding that. And
how can people reach you?
My poetry page, a lot of my followers message me regarding anything domestic violence related, or if they just have a question, or
can you tell us the at?
Yeah, it's at Sara Poetry Official.
Okay.
Sara with no H.
Cool.
Yeah, so that's a way that I connect with a lot of women, and I'm actually proud of a lot of the women who've reached out to me, they were brave enough to share their stories with me, and and I would offer my guidance, and no pressure whatsoever, just like I just let them know that I'm here for you, your voice deserves to be heard. And then randomly I'll get like a message a couple months later, and it's from the same person saying, I'm so happy, I'm happy I made this choice.
Wow.
It could be, it's, the messages can be different, but like it's been nothing but positive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What other resources can we leave people with who are dealing with domestic abuse?
There's the Suicide Prevention Hotline, which is 1-800-273-8255. And then there's the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which is 1-800-799-7233. Also in our community, Access has a great domestic violence program, as well as First Step.
This is First Step?
Yes,
Yep.
this card is First Step. I went to First Step, and they have a 24-hour helpline, which is 734-722-6800, and a toll-free helpline, which is 1-888-453-5900, or you can go to www.firststep-mi.org. And the people are so nice there. They have helped me a lot, and they offer stuff such as counseling, which that's what I did, advocacy. They go with you to court, so that way you feel like you're not alone in court, because it's a tedious process. So they have an advocate standing with you in court and basically telling you how it's going to go and what to expect. And they have shelters over there. If you have children, they have services for children over there. They have so many resources, and to be honest with you, I wish I knew about First Step sooner. But everything happens for a reason, and till this day I donate to them just to kind of show thanks for everything that they've done. So yeah,
I'm so grateful for you, and I'm sure other people listening, whether they feel like they can reach out to you, whether they call one of these hotlines anonymously, whether they never reach out right now or aren't ready, I think that there's so many more people than both of us know who are listening and are grateful and have seen themselves in part of your story. I just thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you for having me.
It was so good to see you.
Thank you.
Of course.